This next video is going to be on Darwin's theory of natural selection and the different parts of natural selection. So I first want to start off with this quote from Charles Darwin in 1809, and it says, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change." This essentially sums up what natural selection is. Natural selection is a mechanism of evolution, meaning that it's a driving force of making populations evolve, along with things like genetic drift and mutations, which we'll talk about later. But what Darwin is saying here is that when you hear the term survival of the fittest or organisms that are most fit, we're not actually talking about strength or intelligence here. We're actually talking about organisms that are best adapted to their environment and can survive and reproduce and pass on those mutations or those traits that are beneficial. So there are four main components of natural selection that Darwin mentioned in his writing on the Origin of Species. The first is overproduction, and so what this means is that all organisms are going to produce more offspring than they could possibly care for. Think about fish, for example. Fish produce hundreds of offspring and spawning. However, not all of those are going to survive to a reproductive age. Sea turtles, that's another example. So this overproduction or this overabundance of organisms allows for differential survival, or ensuring that at least some of an organism will survive, or population. The second component is competition. As a result of this overproduction or this overpopulation of organisms, you also have competition, which is maybe over food source or over a habitat. And so this competition allows for differential survival, which can drive natural selection. The third component of it is survival of the fittest. This is what Darwin was talking about in that quote on the last slide. Fitness. This is a term that describes the ability of an individual to survive and reproduce. So survival of the fittest means that those organisms that are best adapted to their environment are going to survive and reproduce and pass those traits on to their offspring. And that's how natural selection occurs. And then the fourth component is variations and mutations. So naturally, thanks to there are going to be variations within a population. We've talked about that with the genetics a little bit. But these variations or these differences in organisms and then these random mutations which can lead to change also drives natural selection. One of the most well-studied cases of natural selection in real time is the peppered moths. This was a study that began in the Industrial Revolution, took place, if you recall from history, during the Industrial Revolution, we started having this mass growth of factories. And so with these factories, we were also producing pollutants into the air, and a lot of smog coming out of these factories as well. But what happened is, at the time, there were these white peppered moths, or these light moths, that were pretty high in abundance. Their background allowed them to blend in very easily and avoid predators. Well, after the Industrial Revolution and the pollutants and the smog, which changed all of the trees and the habitat to like this dark black color, you can see, based on this graph, that the dark-colored moth population went up and the light-colored moth population went down. So what happened here? Somewhere in that original population of light-colored moths, there was a organism that had some mutation which allowed it to be a darker color. This darker color allowed it to blend in better with its environment. If it could blend in, that means it wouldn't get eaten, which means that it can survive and reproduce. And so that is how the number of the dark-colored moths will actually increase. It's not that the white just turned to black to blend in, it's that there was a mutation. That mutation was beneficial, and so those organisms that contain that mutation could survive and reproduce. The ones who didn't would decrease in size. That's natural selection. There are 5 types of selection that we're going to talk about briefly. The first is stabilizing selection. And so stabilizing selection is a type of natural selection in which both extremes are going to be selected against. So for example, if we're looking at birth mass here, down here you have a very low birth mass, and over here you have a very high birth mass. In stabilizing selection, there's a shift towards the average or the middle. So that's why babies are typically anywhere between 7 and 9 ounces when they're born. That's a pretty average birth mass. Stabilizing selection has occurred to prevent babies that have a really low birth mass and babies that have a very high, as both of those correlate to a high mortality. The second type of selection is disruptive selection. This is the opposite of stabilizing. This is when in a population the average trait is not favored or selected against, which means that your two extremes actually increase. So if you're looking at a hypothetical population, there you have gray and Himalayan, gray and white rabbits. They're better able to adapt to their rocky environment than the white rabbits, resulting in the disruptive selection. So what you can see here is you have these gray and Himalayan, they can blend in well, but these really white guys in the middle, they can't blend in, so they're selected against. So both extremes are favored in this population. The last is directional selection. This is a type of selection in which there's a shift towards one extreme or the other. The best example of directional selection is the peppered moths. We started with a very light color in the original population, but due to changes during the Industrial Revolution, it actually turned out that the darker moths could survive and reproduce more. That's directional selection. There's a shift towards one extreme. So now the dark colored moths are the ones that are favored, and the white are not favored. So now we're going to talk about the last two ideas here that you're probably familiar with. The first is sexual selection. Sexual selection is based on variation in secondary sex characteristics, and most of the time that's related to competing or attracting a mate. There's a term that you'll see with sexual selection. It's called sexual dimorphism. These are sexual dimorphism is referring to traits that characterize males and females. So for example, horns, antlers, a large stature, strength. All of those are sexual dimorphisms for males. Males will have all of these, females would not. So you have two different traits, or two different groups of traits, if you will, for different sexes. And then there's also artificial selection. And this is actually breeding individuals or organisms with desired traits. In most, currently, artificial selection has taken over almost everything. Racehorses, they have been artificially selected to be the way they are. Dogs, almost every dog breed has been artificially selected for certain traits. That's why you can get these mixed breeds. Cabbage, that is a food that we eat. That actually comes from a mustard seed that was artificially selected to be food. So those are the two types, or the last two types of selection.